as a sign of hope, and as a sign of hope coming also from the youth. Mr. Trin Hu Long from a human rights lawyer from Voice, can he identify himself? The young gentleman has, correct? You're from Vietnam, but I also saw Manila, Philippines, so I got a little confused here. So I was wondering, don't worry, based in Manila, very good. But this gentleman, together with a few young people here, have agreed to start a Facebook page that will connect all of us together so that this slant of the democracy that we are committing ourselves to, this slant of working as human rights defenders for the rights that we have spoken of, will be taken forward. The organizers can be happy, George, you can be happy. The legacy doesn't stop here, it continues, but it continues not by people like you or people like me, it carries on by young people like Mr. Long. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Those were very motivational words, I must say. And now I would like to invite Mr. Carl Gershwin, President, National Endowment for Democracy.
Can I speak from here? Or
Sure, most welcome.
I'm happy to speak from here. Well, I want to thank everyone here. It's just an enormous group, and everybody has stayed. I think that's terrific. I said yesterday that that may have something to do with the fact that you can't go back to your hotel room. But I think the energy in this audience has been just tremendous. And I want you to know that I have learned a tremendous amount at this meeting. I mean, at every session, I listen closely, and you know, the talent, the issues, the complexity of the issues, the energy of the people, the struggle that's taking place. It's something that, you know, I benefited from greatly, and I think a lot of people here do. So I just want to begin by thanking George for, you know, coming to us, you know, when was it? October of 2012, with the idea of organizing a meeting around the legacy of George Fernandez, the other George, George Fernandez. George Fernandez. You know, it was, I can remember it was in, I think it was during my first visit to India in 1996 that George Fernandez said, there's a guy you have to meet. And he's the one who developed the whole panchayat system in the reform in India. His name is George Matthew. He has this institution, and that's how we got together. I knew George Fernandez from the Socialist International, believe it or not. That's why I'm a dissident, you know, because to be a socialist or a social democrat in the United States, a rarity. You could fit us into a phone booth back then. But, you know, that's where I got my political grounding, my political training, with the person I always thought was the, as Fred Redmond said last night, the U.S. equivalent of George Fernandez, which was Bayard Rustin, who was my mentor. In any event, I want to thank George. I want to thank the Ned Spoor Institutes for all the work they did. I want to thank the Asia Democracy Network and Anselmo and Shin and everyone else. And I especially want to thank, you know, the secret of Ned's success is that we have a great staff. And so it's Mona, Palki, Lynn, and Wilson. Thank you. In mentioning the Asia Democracy Network, I want everyone here to know I've just come with Lynn from Korea, and we're preparing for the 8th assembly of the World Movement for Democracy, which will take place in Seoul, Korea, November 1st to 4th, 2015. And we're actively preparing for that, and I know that many people here are going to be with us in Seoul. Yesterday, His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, you should have more Africans here. You should have some people from the Middle East, some Arabs. And I want to say, you know, Your Holiness, please just wait. You know, we're going to all get together in Seoul. There'll be a lot of Africans there. There'll be a lot of Arabs. There'll be Russians. There'll be Ukrainians. There'll be people from all over Latin America, from Venezuela, from Cuba. We're going to have, and, you know, Eurasia. It'll be everyone. And it's very, very exciting to have that kind of a gathering come together, and I want you all to know about it. The main purpose of our getting together in Korea is going to be something very interesting. You know, our friend Larry Diamond has talked about the democracy recession. You know, Freedom House has said democracy, freedom has declined in the world for each of the last 9 years. And things are not going well. We talk about that a lot. It's the issue of the Journal of Democracy about, is democracy in decline in the world? You might not know it as much from Asia, where I think there's more positive energy. But, you know, in Eurasia, especially Russia, Ukraine, some places in Latin America, countries I mentioned, Venezuela, Cuba, Africa, there's a terrible problem of governance. And, you know, obviously the Middle East, post-Arab Spring, democracy has real trouble. And what we're going to try to do at this assembly is we're going to try to, you know, develop a perspective, adopt a declaration, a new statement of purpose and principle about how to reverse this decline. And that's what we're really doing. And I think it's very, very important that that meeting happened in Asia, and that, you know, people from all these other regions can connect with Asia. And we're going to be talking about a number of really critical problems. One of them will be what we call the authoritarian resurgence. A lot of authoritarian countries, China being one of them, and the rise of China, and its effort not only to repress people in China, but also through, I think we heard a lot of this morning in the session on land rights, you know, with its trying to pursue its economic interests, it intervenes in countries in a way that really undermines the rule of law, and because they just want to exploit the countries for economic purposes, but also changing international norms. So China is one country, Russia another, Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and some smaller countries like Azerbaijan, Belarus. There has been a resurgence, and they are pushing much more aggressively than they ever pushed before to repress civil society, to control information, to control the narrative of issues. And I think civil society has really been unsettled around the world. You know, it looked like after 1989 that it would almost be easy, the opening of space for civil society, but now it's being closed, and civil society is going to have to develop new tactics, new strategies for pushing back, and that's one of the things we're going to be discussing. Another thing will be the whole problem of the quality of democracy in the world and the difficulties of democracy. That's really been the main issue in the sessions here, and all the sessions we've talked about how even countries that have certain democratic forms, how to make that real, and how to avoid the problem of democratic backsliding like you've had in Thailand, that you're having in Turkey, and in Hungary, and a number of other countries that have moved toward democracy, how to reverse the democratic backsliding, and how to make democracy work. This is a second, you know, major challenge. There's also, you know, the challenge of democratic transition. It hasn't been going very well, the failure of transition in the Arab world, the difficulties of the transition today in Burma. And one of the lessons that we will be talking about in Seoul, and which civil society has to begin to think about, is how to make the transition, something that Bayard Rustin once talked about. He once wrote an article, From Protest to Politics. How to make the transition from protest to politics, from struggle in the street to get rid of an authoritarian government to then building democracy, which is extremely difficult and can be easily reversed if you don't do it well. A lot of the activists in Ukraine have made the transition from the Maidan to parliament. And there'll be Ukrainians there who have done that, and we need to talk about that. There are just, you know, many of these issues. There's the issue of extremism, religious extremism, ethnic extremism, which you have in countries, you know, in Burma today, in Sri Lanka, and in many other countries where nationalism and ethnic and religious extremism are exploited by demagogues and political leaders to try to gain power. And how does civil society fight against that? How do we build networks of support and solidarity? So there are a lot of those issues that we're going to be talking about how to make democracy work better. And a third issue we're going to be talking about is how do we reverse the decline of democratic will in the democratic West, in my country, in Europe? You know, our countries are so self-absorbed and have experienced since the financial crisis of 2008 such serious economic problems. These problems continue, and problems of governance in Europe and in the United States, that we've lost that kind of commitment that we used to have for really supporting democracy internationally. My own feeling is that the only way the democratic will is going to be restored in the West is really from people like yourselves, people who are on the front line struggling for democracy, who know what's at stake, and who have not lost hope and are prepared to fight. My hope is that that will help energize democratic will in the established democracies of the West, which are today in great crisis. And there's then a fourth issue that we'll talk about, which is the internet and the effort by a number of governments to try to restrict internet freedom and control the internet, and the need for civil society to become more sophisticated in protecting itself and developing internet security. Because there, in China and elsewhere, authoritarian governments have learned that, yes, the internet can be a tool by oppositions, but they can use the internet to control opposition, to maintain surveillance over dissidents, and to control the information flow. And this is what's happening, and they would like to eliminate internet security. So these are big issues, and we're going to talk about China too, because, you know, certainly what happened, China's the largest and, you know, authoritarian country in the world, and what happens in China really is going to influence the future of democracy in the world, and that's obviously a critical issue for all of us. I mean, I believe there's hope, and we're going to be talking about this. I believe there's hope. You know, the decline in oil prices created really serious problems in Russia and Venezuela and Iran and elsewhere. You know, a lot of people who think seriously about China thinks that it's not, that there's a real crisis of stability in the regime. I've talked with Hang Dongfang about that. I believe, you know, but even if an authoritarian regime has a crisis and even collapses, that's not necessarily a great thing. They've done so much to whip up nationalism that could be very ugly afterwards. And we see what happens sometimes when dictatorships fall, but some very ugly things come out after the dictatorship falls. So we have a long and a difficult struggle ahead of us. But what gives me hope is the activism of civil society. Because during this period, when people in the United States and elsewhere have sort of lost interest in the struggle and are not showing the kind of solidarity that maybe once was shown, civil society has not given up. People on the front lines are giving their lives for freedom, for democracy, for dignity, for human rights. And they're a model to all of us, and that's going to continue. The question is, can we develop the solidarity, the networking, the unity that's going to be needed to really not only win this struggle, but then to do the difficult work of building democracy, because it's never easy. There are always going to be people trying to undermine it. Democracy is a very, very difficult thing to establish, and it needs people who are devoted, who are committed to democracy in principle, who have the courage to fight for democracy and the wisdom to know how to work to consolidate democracy. These are very, very difficult things. I'm excited about the rise of the Asia Democracy Network. I think it's a very important new force for Asia, and I think it's going to be a wonderful opportunity to link that new network with people around the world who are struggling for freedom and democracy. So I hope you'll all be with us when we get together in Seoul in November. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. So without fear and with hope, I would now like to invite Mr. Richard Gupwell, former political advisor to the socialist groups of the European Parliament.
Excuse me if I stand up, but I've been sitting too long for the last 2 days. Honorable Yashwant, Sinha, George, Carl, all the co-organizers of our conference, and all the teams who've supported them, because this has been a wonderful and very well organized conference. I was very happy to be invited by my old friend George Matthew, even though he considers me still to be a British imperialist. It has been a wonderful conference. And in particular, I've been so pleased that there has been such a wonderful presence of Tibetans here. Because so often, as you pointed out, people are frightened of holding meetings about Tibet because of pressure from China, from the Chinese authorities. Even people don't even think to organize it because they think that there might be pressure if they were to do it. So in India, of course, I don't think this is so much of a problem, but it's been so nice to have the Tibetans here, and it was wonderful on our first day with the inaugural session that His Holiness the Dalai Lama was able to come. And I felt very sad that he wasn't able to travel to South Africa and be present at the birthday celebrations of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, his very dear friend. I think that was terrible. Now, I have been asked to talk about George Fernandez, but let me introduce myself first. I'm the chairman of a little organization called the Jivika Trust, which is a small charity based in London, which undertakes rural development projects in India, in the poorer parts of India, working with local grassroots NGOs. It's based on the ideas of Dr. Fritz Schumacher, who, for people of my age, will remember his book that was entitled Small is Beautiful, but the subtitle was Economics as if People Mattered. Sometimes his theories are referred to as Buddhist economics. Now, this organization was set up in the mid-1970s, and George Fernandez was always a very strong supporter. And George Matthew and I once attended a conference they had with Indian development NGOs near Lucknow, where we had to arrive on motorcycles, I remember. I'm also the vice chair of the European Institute for Asian Studies, as George said, which was set up in 1899 and in many ways inspired by George Matthew having set up his own I should call it, not ISIS, as somebody said, the Institute for Social Sciences here in Delhi. George Fernandez came twice to speak at meetings of our institute in Brussels, and he was always an honorary member of our institute. And as George said earlier, from 1976 to 1996, I was a political advisor to the socialist group in the European Parliament, and that's how I got to meet George Fernandez. Now, about George Fernandez. He was born in Mangalore, as we know, in June 1930, and George Matthew told us yesterday about his early life and his trade union organization work in Mangalore and Bombay. In 1961, he was elected to the Bombay Municipal Council. In 1967, he was elected for the first time to the Lok Sabha for the Bombay South constituency, defeating a sitting Congress minister who had a very large majority. And for doing that, George came to be known as George the Giant Killer. In 1969, he became the General Secretary of the Samyukta Socialist Party, and in the 1971 election, the Socialists were very heavily defeated, and later that year they merged to form the Socialist Party, which was the original name of the party which was set up by J.P. Narayan in 1948. And in January 1973, George became the chairman of the Socialist Party. And he took the Socialist Party back into full membership of the Socialist International, which is where you met him. But that gave George the opportunity to meet the main European and other international leaders of the Socialist International. George Matthew told us how he became president of the All India Railwaymen's Federation and was involved in this major strike, after which thousands and thousands of railway workers were put in prison. This was one episode of Mrs. Indira Gandhi's growing authoritarianism. In the 1971 election, which she won, she promised to abolish poverty, instead of which she abolished democracy. And there was the movement led by J. Prakash Narayan, and in turn Mrs. Gandhi's emergency rule in 1975. Again, mass arrests George Fernandez went underground, evading arrest for 1 year, but he then was also, as they say in India, nabbed by the police and put in prison. And as George Matthew told us also, some of the most eminent socialist leaders in Europe, including Willy Brandt, who was the chairman of the Social International, Bruno Kreisky from Austria, and Olaf Palme, wrote to Mrs. Gandhi saying, "Let no harm come to this man." He was also supported by others, such as Mario Soares from Portugal. Now, in the European Parliament, I, as a young political advisor just arrived, managed to persuade my socialist group to get a debate in the European Parliament on the situation in India. Mm-hmm. This occurred at the very beginning of 1977, and our group made it perfectly clear that our future relations with India, which were based on the Economic Cooperation Agreement, Commercial Cooperation Agreement of 1973, would be dependent upon our socialist comrades in India being released and free and fair elections being held. Now, we know that during the course of the emergency, the main non-communist opposition parties decided that the only way to defeat Mrs. Gandhi was to merge their parties. And the Socialist Party very reluctantly agreed to merge with the then Jana Sangh, the Organization Congress of Morarji Desai, the Lok Dal of Charan Singh, into this Janata Party. And by doing this, by abandoning their independent party structure, they managed to win decisively the general election of 1977, and George Fernandez became industry minister. In 1978, George visited the European Commission to discuss future economic cooperation between India and the European Economic Community, and while he was there, he also traveled the short distance to Luxembourg to meet members of the socialist group and thank them for having this debate in the European Parliament, and that was the first chance I had to meet George Fernandez. He was brought by a young official from the